The Woman in the Rain. The icy wind sliced through the streets of Chicago like a blade, whistling between the towering glass skyscrapers and ruffling the collar of Daniel Whittaker's tailored coat. The January rain wasn't the soft, gentle kind. It pounded relentlessly against the pavement, turning the sidewalks into slick, treacherous mirrors reflecting neon signs and headlights. Daniel barely noticed. He strode down the wet sidewalk, phone pressed to his ear, skimming numbers and contracts, while his assistant, Marcus, rattled off updates on the upcoming acquisition. Another deal, another billion. Success had long since lost its flavor, but Daniel didn't question it anymore. The chase was all he knew. It filled the silence in his penthouse, masked the emptiness he refused to acknowledge. "Push the board meeting to Thursday," he said curtly, stepping under the awning of the Whittaker International headquarters. The rain drummed a relentless rhythm against the glass above him. "If they can't make it, they're not worth their shares." "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "And the Aspen event." Daniel wasn't listening anymore. Across the street, beneath the flickering sign of a closed pharmacy, a small cluster huddled together. The rain had matted their clothes to their bodies, dark hair plastered to their faces. A woman, arms stretched wide like a protective barrier, shielding three small figures. Children. Triplets, their faces half hidden beneath two thin hoods. Daniel's breath caught. Something about the way the woman stood, the slight tilt of her head, triggered a long-buried memory, a whisper of a past he carefully sealed off behind steel walls. It couldn't be. He took a step closer, his shoes splashing in a shallow puddle. A passing cab honked its horn, but Daniel barely registered the sound. His heart was hammering, his pulse roaring louder than the storm. As the woman turned to comfort one of the girls, her face tilted up toward the dim light of a street lamp. Daniel's world tilted. Amira. The name struck him like a thunderclap. His Amira, the girl he once believed was his forever. The girl who disappeared from his life without a trace 7 years ago. She was thinner now, her skin pale, and her dark curls streaked with dampness. Exhaustion had etched lines beneath her eyes, and her lips were cracked from cold. Yet, despite all that, it was her. There was no mistaking it. For a heartbeat, he couldn't breathe. The triplets huddled closer to their mother, small hands clutching her worn coat. One of the girls turned toward him. A small, heart-shaped face, familiar even through the mist and rain. Daniel's pulse stuttered. The girl's eyes were unmistakable. His eyes. Deep brown, flecked with gold. The same eyes that stared back at him from every mirror. His breath escaped in a jagged gasp, chest tightening with shock, so pure it almost doubled him over. They were his. They had to be. Amira's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his through the haze of rain and streetlight. For an instant, time folded. Years vanished, leaving only them. But her expression wasn't one of longing or relief. It was fury. Pure, unbridled rage flickered like a live wire in her gaze. Hatred sharper than the January air. Daniel took an unconscious step back, stunned by the force of it. "Amira," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "What? How?" "Stay back." Her voice was steel, not the soft, musical laugh he remembered. She gathered the girls behind her like a lioness protecting her cubs, her shoulders squared despite the trembling of her hands. Daniel's throat went dry. "Please. Don't." Her voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare come near us." One of the girls, the one with his eyes, stumbled, her little legs shaky from cold and exhaustion. Instinctively, Daniel moved toward her, arms outstretched. "Don't touch her." Amira's voice was sharp enough to cut through glass, raw panic vibrating through it. "Stay away from my daughters. My daughters." The words were a punch to the gut. Daughters. Plural. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the truth, the impossible reality standing in front of him. "Amira, just talk to me. Please," Daniel pleaded, desperation creeping into his tone. Let me help." "There's nothing you can do," she hissed, eyes darting around the street like she expected someone to yank them into the shadows at any moment. "You don't get to show up now. Not after 7 years." The girls clung to her coat, their wide eyes darting between their mother and the stranger who stood frozen on the sidewalk, the man who didn't yet know how much of him existed in each of their faces. "Mommy, I'm cold," the smallest girl whimpered, her voice high and trembling. "I know, baby." Amira's voice softened for her daughter, fingers brushing wet hair from her face, just a little farther. They turned toward a narrow alley, Amira guiding them with the precision of someone who'd navigated too many dangerous nights alone. Daniel's feet refused to move. He stood rooted to the spot, watching as his family, disappeared into the rain. The sidewalk was empty when he finally forced himself to breathe. The steel walls around his heart, the ones he built after she left, crumbled to dust. Everything he thought he knew about Amira, about his life, was a lie. He had daughters. He had a family. And they were out there, cold, wet, afraid, and wanted nothing to do with him. The penthouse was a cavernous silence when Daniel stepped inside hours later, rainwater still clinging to his coat. The view from his floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering skyline, might as well have been black. His fingers shook as he poured whiskey into a crystal glass, not even registering how much he spilled. 7 years of emptiness suddenly made sense. 7 years of unanswered questions, of searching faces in crowds. He wasn't chasing shadows. He'd been chasing them. The elevator chimed, and Marcus stepped in, tablet in hand. "Sir, I've got the reports from thee. I need you to find someone." Daniel cut in, his voice a ragged edge. "Now." Marcus froze, surprised by the rawness in his boss's voice. "Her name is Amira Thomas," Daniel continued, his grip white-knuckled around the glass. "She has 3 daughters, triplets. They're living on the streets." Marcus blinked. "You mean tonight? In this weather?" Daniel's gaze was cold and sharp as a blade. "Find them." Marcus had worked for Daniel long enough to know when orders were non-negotiable. "Yes, sir." "Call every shelter, every soup kitchen. Check security footage from every block within a 10-mile radius." Daniel turned to the window, where rain streaked the glass like tears. "I don't care what it costs. Just find them." As the rain blurred the city lights into a sea of fractured gold and silver, Daniel pressed his hand against the cold glass. 7 years of fortune, of empire building, had meant nothing. Because the only thing that had ever mattered was out there, and she hated him. And yet, for the first time in 7 years, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. Fractured pieces. The soft hum of the Bentley's engine was the only sound in the silent midnight streets of Chicago. Rain smeared the windshield, blurring the world into shifting ribbons of neon and shadow. Daniel Whittaker sat in the back seat, his phone pressed to his ear, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. His Italian leather shoes tapped a frantic rhythm against the floor mat, a telltale sign of the storm brewing inside him. "Sir, we've cross-checked all the shelters within a 10-mile radius." Marcus's voice crackled through the line. "Nothing under her name. No recent intakes matching a woman with 3 kids." Daniel cursed under his breath, fingers digging into his temple. "What about aliases? She might not be using her real name." "We're widening the search now," Marcus replied, the faint sound of keystrokes filling the background. "I'm having security teams canvass the blocks near where you saw her." Daniel's head fell back against the leather seat, eyes shut tight. Images of Amira, soaked and shivering, her arms wrapped tightly around 3 small girls, kept flickering through his mind like an old film reel. His daughters. His daughters. The words tasted foreign, both wondrous and bitter. He thought back to the last time he saw her, 7 years ago. Amira had been radiant then, a law student with eyes full of fire and ambition, her hands always in motion as she dreamed aloud about their future. They talked about children, about traveling the world, about all the things love made possible. And then she vanished. Not a note, not a goodbye. Just silence, a black hole where his heart used to be. "Keep looking," Daniel muttered into the phone, his throat tight. "I don't care how long it takes." He ended the call and stared out into the rain, his reflection flickering in the window. Who had Amira become in these 7 years? And who was he? The man who'd built an empire on the ashes of her absence. The next morning, Daniel stood in the vast, gleaming lobby of Whitaker Tower, surrounded by the quiet hum of executives and assistants rushing to begin their day. Normally, this building, his crown jewel, felt like an extension of himself. Today, it felt like a prison. Marcus approached, tablet in hand, expression tense. "Sir, we found them." Daniel's heart lurched. "Where?" "A shelter on the south side," Marcus said. "Street Ilaris. They checked in under the name Amira Collins last night." Daniel was already moving. "Get the car." "Are you sure you want to go personally?" Marcus asked, following closely. "We can send someone." "No," Daniel snapped. "This is mine." Street Ilaris wasn't the kind of place Daniel belonged. The paint on the exterior was peeling, windows streaked with grime. A faded mural on one brick wall depicted children holding hands, the colors worn and flaking. The cracked sidewalk was littered with cigarette butts and a discarded stuffed bear missing an eye. The Bentley's tires ground to a halt at the curb. Daniel climbed out, his polished shoes landing awkwardly on uneven pavement. The contrast between his bespoke suit and the crumbling building was almost laughable, if anything about this was funny. Inside, the air was stale with the scent of disinfectant and old wood. A bulletin board sagged under the weight of worn flyers, parenting classes, addiction support, missing person notices. Behind the front desk, a tired woman with steel gray hair looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of Daniel's tailored coat. "Can I help you?" she asked, suspicion curling around each word. "I'm looking for Amira Collins," Daniel said, keeping his voice low. The woman's expression hardened. "Are you family?" He opened his mouth, then hesitated. Was he? Legally? No. Emotionally? He wasn't sure anymore. Before he could form an answer, movement at the top of the stairs caught his eye. Amira. She was descending slowly, cradling a small, coughing figure wrapped in a thin, fraying blanket. Even from this distance, Daniel could see the shadows beneath her eyes, the slump of her shoulders beneath the oversized coat. The little girl's head lolled against her mother's chest, her cheeks flushed with fever. Daniel took a step forward. Amira. She froze, eyes widening in fear and fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" The receptionist's gaze ping-ponged between them, clearly picking up on the storm brewing in the air. "She's sick," Daniel said, voice thick with concern. "Let me help." "We don't need your help," Amira hissed, tightening her grip on her daughter. "We've gotten by without you just fine." A harsh cough from the child broke through the tension. Daniel took another step forward, his hands raised in surrender. "Please," he said softly. "She needs a doctor." Amira's jaw clenched. For a long moment, she stared at him, weighing pride against maternal instinct. Finally, she gave a small, reluctant nod. "Just until she's better," she whispered. Daniel exhaled, relief flooding through him like warm water. "My car's outside." The ride to the hospital was silent, save for the little girl's wheezing breaths. Amira sat curled against the far door, her body angled protectively around her daughter, as though even the air between them wasn't safe. Daniel's eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror, tracing the curve of her profile. 7 years apart, and he still knew the shape of her face better than his own. But the girl in the backseat wasn't the Amira he remembered. This woman was forged from struggle and survival, her softness tempered into something sharper, harder. At the hospital, the doctors moved quickly, whisking the little girl away into a brightly lit examination room. Daniel stood beside Amira, feeling utterly useless. His wealth, his power, none of it mattered here. How long has she been sick? Daniel asked softly. Amira didn't look at him. A few days. His stomach twisted. You should have taken her in sooner. Her head snapped toward him, eyes flashing. With what money, Daniel? You think hospitals treat people like us for free? Guilt settled like a stone in his gut. He wanted to argue, to explain that if he'd known, if he'd had any clue they existed, things would have been different. But the words felt hollow. I'm sorry, he said instead. Amira folded her arms across her chest, her protective shell snapping back into place. Sorry doesn't help her. A nurse appeared, smiling gently. She's stable. Pneumonia. But we caught it in time. She'll need antibiotics and rest. Thank you, Amira said, her voice cracking with relief. Daniel felt a fierce surge of protectiveness rise inside him, an unfamiliar, primal need to shield this fragile family from everything, including his own past failures. You can stay at my place, he said suddenly. Amira's head whipped toward him. What? Just until she's better, Daniel said quickly, holding up his hands. No strings, no lawyers, just a warm place for them. For you. Her suspicion was a living thing between them, thick and heavy. But the weight of exhaustion, of years of hard choices, pulled at her shoulders. Just until she's better, she whispered. Daniel nodded. Just until. The elevator ride to Daniel's penthouse was silent. Amira stood slightly apart, her arms wrapped around the sleeping girl. The other two girls stood close to her sides, wide-eyed at the gleaming elevator, its mirrored walls reflecting their tired faces. When the doors slid open, Amira inhaled sharply. The penthouse was a world away from the shelter. All glass, marble, and sleek furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. This is yours? One of the girls, the quiet one, whispered. Yes, Daniel said softly. The girls drifted forward, hesitant explorers in an alien world. Amira stood frozen, the contrast between this life and theirs too stark to process. But Daniel only saw the cracks in her armor and the strength beneath them. For the first time in years, he had them under his roof. For the first time, hope flickered. But Amira's walls were high, and breaking them down would take more than wealth. It would take truth. It would take war. Shadows between us. The silence in Daniel's penthouse felt heavier than the thick Chicago fog pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The triplets had fallen asleep, curled up together on the massive sectional couch, their small bodies rising and falling in unison, synchronized by a lifetime of shared survival. Simon's hand clutched a faded stuffed bunny missing an ear, the lone relic from whatever childhood Amira had managed to cobble together for them. Amira stood stiffly by the window, her arms folded tight across her chest, like she was trying to hold herself together. She hadn't sat down since they arrived, hadn't accepted so much as a glass of water. The distance she maintained between herself and Daniel was measured and intentional, a boundary carved from 7 years of pain and survival. You don't have to stand, Daniel said quietly, his voice too soft for a room so large. This isn't a prison. She didn't look at him, her gaze locked on the glittering skyline beyond the glass, her reflection a ghost in the surface. No, she said, voice taut. Prisons are at least predictable. The words landed like a slap. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fists curling at his sides. Every instinct in him screamed to close the gap between them, to pull her into his arms and force her to remember who they were before. But this wasn't about him. Not anymore. You can hate me, he said finally. I probably deserve it, but don't punish them because of me. He gestured toward the sleeping girls. They deserve to be warm. Safe. Amira's chin lifted, her jaw tightening. I'm not punishing anyone, Daniel. I've been keeping them safe without you for 7 years. And you shouldn't have had to. His voice broke slightly on the last word, raw with guilt and frustration. I didn't know. If I'd known. You didn't look hard enough. She cut in, her voice sharp, her reflection glaring back at him. You gave up. I never did. Daniel took a step closer. What happened, Amira? One day we were planning our future, and the next you were gone. No word. No trace. You just vanished. She turned to face him then, and the weight of her stare nearly knocked the breath from his chest. Her eyes weren't just angry. They were haunted. He wasn't the only one who had lost something. You think I chose this, she whispered. You think I wanted to disappear. Daniel's brow furrowed. Then why? She shook her head, tears glinting in her eyes. Because I didn't have a choice. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the heating system and the rhythmic tick of the sleek clock on the wall. The space between them was thick with unspoken words and years of fractured memories. Make me understand, Daniel said, quieter this time. Please. Amira turned back to the window, her fingers tightening against her arms. Your father gave me a choice, Daniel, she said, her voice a mix of bitterness and pain. Disappear or destroy my family. Daniel's breath left him in a sharp rush. My father. He had everything planned, she said, each word like glass underfoot. He knew I was pregnant before I did. He knew where my mother worked, where my sister went to school. He made it very clear that if I stayed with you, my family would suffer. Daniel staggered back a step, the room tilting slightly. That doesn't make sense. I would have. You would have fought him, Amira said, turning to face him. You would have risked everything. And he knew that. So he didn't come after you. He came after me. Daniel's stomach churned with nausea. His father had always been cold, calculating. But this was something else. This was evil. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. I tried. Amira's voice cracked. I called your phone over and over. It was disconnected. I sent emails. They bounced back. I went to your office and security told me you'd moved. I went to your building and the doorman said you left the country. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. I never left. I know that now. Her laugh was brittle. But back then, I was alone. Pregnant. Your father made sure I had nowhere to go. I lost my scholarship. My mom lost her job. And every door I knocked on was locked before I could touch it. He wanted to scream, to destroy something, to undo every second of pain she'd endured. But there was no undoing it. There was only the wreckage. I didn't give up on us, she said softly, her shoulders shaking. But the world made sure you gave up on me. Daniel's hands shook at his sides. 7 years. 7 years of thinking she left him, when all along his own blood had torn them apart. I'll fix this, he said, steel hardening in his voice. I swear to you, Amira, I'll fix everything. She shook her head, her face a mask of exhaustion. You can't fix what's already broken. Her voice was so soft. He almost didn't hear the next part. And I don't trust you to try. Those words hurt more than anything his father ever said. The next morning, Daniel stood in his private office, the phone pressed to his ear as Marcus delivered his report. It's all true, Marcus said grimly. Your father blacklisted Amira from every major law firm, cut off her scholarship, and had your building security instructed to block her if she showed up. Daniel's fingers curled so tightly around his pen it snapped in half. Why? You know why, Marcus said softly. He saw her as a threat. To your future, to the Mercer name, to the empire. He wanted her gone, so he made sure she was. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the framed photo on his desk. A photo from college. Daniel and Amira sprawled on a picnic blanket, her head on his lap, both of them laughing at something long forgotten. Find every scrap of evidence, Daniel said coldly. Emails, memos, phone records. I want a full timeline. Then leak it to every media outlet we can reach. There was silence on the line. Are you sure, sir? Daniel's smile was razor sharp. I'm done protecting him. That night, Daniel found Amira in the small guest room where she'd settled the girls. The triplets were curled up in one bed, limbs tangled together like a litter of puppies. Amira sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing Simone's curls with a gentleness that made Daniel ache. "I know you don't trust me," Daniel said from the doorway, "but I'm not going to stop trying." Amira didn't look at him. "Why now?" "Because I was blind," he said softly. "Because I let him twist my whole life into something I didn't even recognize. But you were the only real thing in it. You still are." Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. "They deserve better," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "And so do you." For a long time, she said nothing. Then, without turning, she whispered, "They've never had a father. Don't make promises you can't keep." Daniel stepped into the room, his voice low and certain. "I'm not leaving this time." And even though Amira didn't answer, her silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a door, cracked open, just slightly. Cracks in the armor. The quiet hum of the penthouse felt too big for Amira. Even in the soft morning light filtering through the endless windows, she still felt small, like the walls were moving further apart, stretching away until she was nothing but a speck in a space too grand for someone like her. The girls were still asleep, curled into each other's warmth in the unfamiliar beds Daniel had ordered for them overnight. Simone had adjusted the fastest, her curious nature absorbing the strange luxury like sunlight. Layla was cautious, polite but always watching, quietly cataloging every unfamiliar thing. Nia was stone. Even now, Amira could feel Nia's doubt radiating from the room down the hall. Her oldest daughter carried every burden Amira had tried to hide. The hunger, the cold nights in shelters, the long days spent sitting in library corners, while Amira worked 2 jobs. Nia remembered. She always would. The sleek knock at the bedroom door made Amira flinch. "Breakfast." Daniel's voice was soft, hesitant. "I made pancakes." Amira exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. Of course he made pancakes. He probably thought flipping batter would somehow patch over 7 years of absence. She opened the door, and for a moment they just stood there, the weight of everything unsaid crowding between them like a physical barrier. "Thank you," she said quietly, brushing past him. The kitchen was too shiny, too modern, like it had never been used for anything other than catered meals and espresso shots. And yet there was Daniel, standing at the counter, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly tousled, standing over a frying pan with a spatula clutched in one hand. The sight was so absurd, so domestic, that Amira nearly laughed. The pancakes were awful. Burnt on one side, undercooked on the other, uneven blobs rather than perfect circles. Daniel stood next to the stack, like a nervous kid waiting for a grade. Simone, to her credit, took a huge bite and beamed at him. "They're perfect," she chirped, syrup clinging to her chin. Amira arched an eyebrow. "They're edible." Daniel exhaled with exaggerated relief, earning a small giggle from Layla. "Guess I'm a little out of practice," Daniel admitted. "My chef handles most meals." "Rich people problems," Nia muttered from the corner. Daniel didn't flinch at the jab, though Amira saw the flicker of guilt pass through his eyes. He deserved every word, and to his credit, he didn't try to dodge them. Instead, he set another pancake in front of Simone and settled onto a stool at the island, bracing his elbows against the cold marble. "Are we going to talk about it?" Amira asked quietly. Daniel's jaw tensed. "Which part?" She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "The part where your father systematically destroyed my life, or the part where you didn't even realize it was happening?" The guilt in Daniel's eyes was real, deeper than any corporate mistake or financial misstep. "I'm not going to make excuses," he said. "I believed what I was told because I wanted to. Because if you'd left me, by choice, at least it meant I hadn't completely failed." Amira's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, remembering all the nights she whispered prayers into the dark that Daniel would somehow find her. "You did fail," she said, voice soft but cutting. "But so did I." Daniel shook his head. You didn't fail. You survived. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft scraping of forks on plates as the girls quietly devoured their misshapen pancakes. There was something unsettling about how easily they had adapted to luxury, how quickly survival-trained children learned to take advantage of warmth and abundance. It broke Amira's heart. I can't trust this, Amira finally said, gesturing around the penthouse. This isn't real. Daniel's gaze followed hers. It's real for them. It can be. But Amira knew better. She'd lived through the rug being pulled out from under her too many times. She knew better than to believe in shiny surfaces and sweet words. We have nowhere else to go right now, she admitted, the confession bitter on her tongue. So we'll stay. Daniel's relief was immediate, but muted, tempered by the truth they both knew. This was temporary. Amira's walls were still firmly in place. For the girls' sake, though, they could pretend. Later that day, the triplets explored the penthouse like it was a museum, though Nia maintained her wary distance. Daniel watched them from the doorway to his office, hands shoved deep into his pockets. Every time Simone or Layla laughed, his heart cracked open a little more, because it was unfamiliar. Their joy was something he'd never known firsthand, never earned. He was a stranger to his own daughters, and every glimpse of their wonder was a reminder of all the moments he had lost. He wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between himself and Nia. Every time he stepped closer, her small frame went rigid, her face hardening into something too old for a 7-year-old. She was her mother's daughter, all edges and walls built from necessity. Do you like to read? Daniel asked cautiously as Nia stood by the windows, arms crossed. She shrugged, gaze locked on the skyline. Libraries were warm. Daniel bit the inside of his cheek. I have a library here. You can. I don't need your books. She cut him off sharply. We don't need anything from you. Daniel nodded slowly. Understood. But that night, after the girls were asleep, Daniel quietly placed 3 new books on their nightstand, one for each girl. A gesture, however small. He didn't know if they would accept it. That night, Amira found herself awake long after the penthouse had gone still. The silence was so different from the noise of shelters. No snoring strangers, no whispered conversations through thin walls. Just silence. She found Daniel in the living room, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand, the skyline stretching endlessly behind him. You don't drink, she said quietly. Daniel glanced at the glass like he was surprised to see it there. I do now. Amira sat on the opposite end of the couch, their bodies separated by more than just space. You're good at pretending. Daniel's smile was bitter. That's what my father raised me to do. Her brow furrowed. Did you know what he was doing to me? The question hung in the air like smoke. Daniel set down the glass. No, he said softly. But I should have. They sat in silence, the weight of 7 years between them, heavy with all the things they might have been. I'm scared, Amira admitted, the words so soft they almost dissolved in the air. Daniel turned to her. Of me. Of this, she whispered, her hands gesturing to the penthouse, the city, the life they could have had. Of what happens if they get used to it, if they let you in and then you leave. I'm not leaving. She met his gaze. You did before. The blow landed exactly where she intended, and Daniel didn't try to defend himself. I won't make the same mistake twice. Amira wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But hope was dangerous, a luxury she couldn't afford. Good night, Daniel. She stood and left him sitting there, surrounded by all the wealth in the world, and none of the things that truly mattered. The weight of a name. The official letter arrived the next afternoon, delivered by a courier who refused to meet Amira's eye, as she stood in Daniel's gleaming marble foyer, clutching her youngest daughter's hand. She knew it would come. The moment she'd stepped foot inside Daniel's penthouse, accepting even a shred of his help, she'd known this would follow. Walter Whittaker didn't lose, and he certainly didn't let loose ends crawl back into the story. Amira Thomas was a loose end, and she knew it. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal on the thick envelope, the triplets watching from their spot on the plush rug, where they were playing with a set of expensive building blocks Daniel had bought. Daniel, who stood beside her now, his expression cold with barely suppressed fury. "Emergency custody hearing," Amira whispered, the words clinging to her throat like ash. "He's claiming I'm unfit." Daniel snatched the papers from her hands, his jaw tightening so hard Amira could see the muscle twitch. "He can't do this." "He can." Amira's voice was a fragile thread. "And you know it." Walter Whittaker had built his empire on the careful destruction of anything standing in his way. He wasn't just wealthy, he was ruthless. His power stretched into every corner of the city, seeping into courts, social services, media outlets, all of it, a web of influence spun over decades. A homeless mother with a checkered employment history and no assets didn't stand a chance. Not on paper. But Daniel wasn't the same man who had blindly obeyed his father's orders all those years ago. "Let me handle this," Daniel said, voice low and controlled. "I'll destroy whatever case he thinks he has." Amira shook her head, pulling the papers back from his grasp. "It's not just about legal arguments and evidence. It's about perception. People like me don't win against people like you." "People like him," Daniel corrected sharply. "Not me." Amira's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. The lines between Daniel and Walter blurred too easily in her mind. Trusting him meant trusting the world that had nearly crushed her, and she wasn't there yet. That evening, Amira sat curled up on the edge of the girls' shared bed, brushing through Layla's thick curls with a careful hand. The triplets were unusually quiet, sensing the tension that had settled over the penthouse like a storm cloud. "Are we leaving again?" Layla asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Amira's heart cracked, the question as gentle as it was devastating. Her girls had spent their entire lives learning to pack up and disappear at a moment's notice, trained in survival instead of stability. "I don't know yet," Amira admitted, her fingers still threading through her daughter's hair. "But wherever we go, we'll be together." The little girl nodded, content with that. But Nia, always listening, always analyzing, wasn't so easily soothed. "He's going to try to take us away, isn't he?" Nia's voice was harder, her eyes too sharp for her 7 years. Amira couldn't lie. Not to her. "He might try. But you won't let him," Nia said, as if daring her mother to confirm it. Amira leaned down, cupping her daughter's face. No one will take you from me. I promise." But her stomach churned with doubt. Promises were harder to keep when the enemy owned the playing field. Daniel's office had never felt this small. Stacks of documents, reports, and old correspondences cluttered the usually pristine desk. Marcus stood at the far end, sleeves rolled up, hair disheveled. A rare sign of stress from the usually composed assistant. "We have the financial records," Marcus said, flipping through a thick folder. "We can prove Walter has been laundering money through shell corporations for years. Offshore accounts, fake charities. The whole playbook." Daniel barely glanced at the pages. Evidence wasn't the problem. They could sink Walter's reputation in a day if they wanted to. But that wasn't the real battlefield. This wasn't a corporate takeover. This was a fight for his daughters. "He doesn't want custody," Daniel muttered, pacing the length of the office. "He wants to break Amira. He wants her to disappear again." Marcus hesitated. "Do you think she will?" "No." Daniel stopped, staring out at the city. "Not this time. And God help anyone who tried to make her." The first hearing was scheduled just 3 days later. Daniel insisted they arrive together, though Amira was hesitant. Walking into court on the arm of the man whose family was trying to destroy her felt like wearing a target on her back. But the girls needed stability, even if it was stage. The courthouse steps were crawling with photographers and reporters, most already tipped off to this scandalous custody battle brewing between the Whittaker heir and his unfit ex-girlfriend. Amira's stomach churned at the way the headlines wrote themselves before she even stepped inside. Daniel's hand hovered near the small of her back, not quite touching, but offering. Amira didn't take it. Inside, Walter was already seated at the opposing table. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his custom suit impeccable, and his expression serene. As if this was all routine, a minor inconvenience in his otherwise flawless life. But Amira saw the calculation behind his eyes. He didn't acknowledge Daniel. Didn't need to. His attention was entirely on Amira, dissecting her, looking for cracks. The first arguments were procedural, reviewing Amira's history, her employment gaps, the unstable housing situations. Her entire life was boiled down to bullet points on a page, each one painting her as irresponsible, unreliable, unworthy. Daniel's lawyers countered with evidence, receipts, school attendance records, letters from shelter coordinators praising her dedication. But Amira could see it in the judge's eyes, that flicker of doubt, the weight of Walter's name pressing invisibly on the room. They recessed after 2 hours, and Daniel followed Amira into the hallway, his jaw clenched with frustration. "This isn't about facts," Amira said before he could speak. "It's about who they believe." "Then we make them believe us," Daniel said fiercely. "Whatever it takes." She wanted to believe him, but belief had cost her too much already. That night, Amira found herself on the balcony, the cold wind cutting through her sweater. Below, the city sparkled, a world that had always felt just out of reach. This life, this penthouse, this view, it wasn't hers. It was borrowed, temporary, like a dream she'd wake from any second. Daniel stepped outside, his jacket draped over his arm. "You'll catch a cold." "I've had worse," Amira said, not turning. Daniel stood beside her, the silence between them oddly comfortable for once. They weren't the people they'd been. Young, hopeful, untouchable. They were scared and tired, too old for their years. But for the first time, they stood side by side, not across from each other. "I'm not my father," Daniel said quietly. "I know," Amira admitted. "I'll fight him," Daniel continued. "For you. For them." Amira's hands gripped the railing. "I've been fighting for them since the day they were born." "I know," Daniel said again, softer this time. "But you're not alone anymore." The words cracked something inside her, just slightly. She didn't reply, but when Daniel draped his coat over her shoulders, she didn't take it off. The next day, Daniel called his mother. Evelyn Whittaker was an enigma. Graceful, silent, loyal to her husband in public, but behind closed doors, she knew where the bodies were buried. "Mother," Daniel said when she answered, "I need you to testify." There was a pause, then a sigh. "I wondered when you'd ask." "You knew what he did to Amira," Daniel said, barely containing his anger. "Yes." Her voice was weary. "I knew." "Then you owe me this," Daniel said sharply. "You owe them this." Another silence stretched between them, but when Evelyn spoke again, her voice was steady. "I'll be there." For the first time, Daniel felt like the tides were shifting. The price of truth. The courtroom was colder than Amira expected. Not in temperature. The air was neutral, overly controlled by the building's ancient ventilation. But in atmosphere, the polished wooden benches and the towering judge's bench might have seemed imposing once, back when Amira was a law student dreaming of sitting at counsel's table, back before her world fractured. Now this room wasn't intimidating. It was familiar, a battleground, like every shelter hallway and every job interview where her record was a mark against her. She knew how to survive in hostile places, but this wasn't just her fight anymore. Daniel sat beside her, his jaw set, tension radiating off him in waves. Every so often, his gaze flicked toward her, not to reassure her, but to ground himself. He needed this victory almost as much as she did. At the far side of the courtroom, Walter Whittaker sat with his team of high-powered attorneys, each one carefully chosen to shred Amira's life to pieces. His suit was flawless, his silver hair combed with precision, his hands resting lightly on the table, a man who believed his win was inevitable. For a long time, Amira had been terrified of that man. Not today. The girls weren't present. A court-appointed child advocate would interview them privately. But Amira could feel their absence like a missing limb. They were why she was here. They were why she would not break. The judge entered, her presence quieting the murmurs. Judge Moreno was a sharp woman in her 60s, with eyes that could cut through theatrics in seconds. Amira clung to the hope that truth might matter to her. Petition for custody modification, Moreno announced, flipping through the file. Filed by Walter Whittaker, citing concerns over the welfare of the minor children. Counsel, you may begin. Walter's lead attorney, a slick man named Galloway, rose, his smile well-practiced and razor-sharp. Your Honor, the facts are simple. Miss Thomas has a long history of financial instability, irregular housing, and employment gaps. These children have spent their formative years in shelters, exposed to transience, deprivation, and uncertainty. My client, their biological grandfather, merely seeks to provide them the security and stability they deserve. Amira's hands clenched under the table. He's painting me as a cautionary tale, not a mother. Daniel's lawyer, Sarah Hann, rose smoothly. Your Honor, what Attorney Galloway has neglected to mention is that Miss Thomas provided for these children without a single ounce of assistance from the Whittaker family, despite their considerable resources. The lack of financial stability wasn't neglect, it was survival, after being deliberately cut off from any support by the petitioner. Galloway's smile tightened. I wasn't aware blame shifting was the basis for a legal defense. Sarah didn't blink. Blame shifting is unnecessary when the facts speak for themselves. We'll be demonstrating that Miss Thomas's lack of financial resources was not due to irresponsibility, but rather deliberate and systematic targeting by Mr. Whittaker. The murmurs rippled through the gallery, reporters already scribbling notes. Judge Moreno's eyebrow arched. Is that so? Absolutely, Sarah said, setting down a thick binder. But I believe the best person to explain is Mr. Whittaker's own wife. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Evelyn Whittaker entered. A hush fell over the room. Even Walter's usually impassive mask slipped for a fraction of a second. A flicker of shock, quickly buried beneath polished control. Evelyn moved slowly, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her pearl bracelet sliding softly along her wrist. She was the perfect image of old money elegance, but there was something different in her today. A weight lifted, or perhaps a decision made. She settled into the witness chair, her back straight, her hands resting carefully on her lap. Mrs. Whittaker, Sarah began, can you describe your awareness of your husband's interactions with Miss Thomas 7 years ago? Evelyn's gaze drifted briefly to Amira, then to Daniel, and finally settled on her folded hands. Yes, Evelyn said quietly. I was aware. Please elaborate. Evelyn took a deep breath. When my son began dating Miss Thomas in college, my husband was displeased. He believed she was beneath our family. Walter's attorney stood. Relevance? Overruled, Judge Moreno said. I want to hear this. Evelyn's fingers twisted slightly in her lap. When Daniel and Miss Thomas grew serious, Walter took steps to end the relationship. Steps? Sarah pressed. He had her scholarship revoked, Evelyn said softly. He contacted law firms and advised them not to hire her. When she attempted to contact Daniel after discovering her pregnancy, Walter intercepted every message. The courtroom fell utterly silent. Sarah walked closer. To your knowledge, was Daniel ever aware that Amira was trying to reach him? No, Evelyn said. Walter told him she had left without explanation. Daniel's hands curled into fists beneath the table, his body trembling with rage he barely contained. Why didn't you intervene? Sarah asked. Evelyn's throat worked as she swallowed. Because I was a coward, she admitted, and because Walter always wins. Not today, Daniel whispered under his breath. "Thank you, Mrs. Whittaker," Sarah said softly. No further questions. Walter's attorney didn't bother cross-examining. There was nothing to salvage. The final witness was Amira herself. She stood, her knees trembling slightly, but her spine was straight. She was not a victim. Not anymore. "Miss Thomas," Sarah began, "how did you provide for your daughters after your relationship with Daniel ended?" Amira took a breath. "I worked. Nights, weekends, whenever I could. I cleaned office buildings, waited tables, stocked shelves. Were there times you couldn't afford stable housing?" Amira's throat tightened. "Yes, but my daughters always had somewhere to sleep, even if it wasn't always a home." "Did you ever abuse, neglect, or endanger them?" "No," Amira said fiercely. "Never." "Despite the difficulties, were your daughters well cared for?" "I did everything I could," Amira said. "They are my whole world." Sarah nodded. No further questions. Galloway stood, circling the table slowly. "Miss Thomas," he said smoothly, "in your own words, you've lived in shelters, worked multiple jobs, and struggled to provide basic needs. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Would you agree that such instability is harmful to young children?" Amira's jaw tightened. "Stability isn't about money. It's about love." "And yet," Galloway said, "you accepted help from Daniel Whittaker. The same family you claim ruined your life." Amira lifted her chin. "I didn't accept help for me. I accepted it for my daughters. Because you knew you couldn't provide for them alone. Because they deserve every chance I can give them," Amira said sharply. "And because Daniel is not his father." Daniel's gaze shot to her, startled by the quiet conviction in her voice. "No further questions," Galloway said, sitting down with a sneer. The judge's decision was read later that week. It was clear and final. The petition for custody modification was denied. Walter Whittaker was barred from future legal action involving the triplets. Daniel was granted joint custody, not because of wealth or family name, but because Amira herself had stood before the court and said the words, "They deserve to know him." Walter didn't attend the final ruling. No one saw him leave the courthouse. That evening, Amira stood on the penthouse balcony, the city glittering below. Daniel stepped beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked. "For believing I can be better." Amira turned to face him, her eyes softer than they'd been in years. "We'll see." She didn't offer forgiveness, but for the first time, she offered something else. Possibility. Behind them, the triplets' laughter rang through the penthouse, the sound of a family piecing itself back together, one fragile moment at a time. And for now, that was enough.